Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into this because we are looking at a story today that truly, honestly has it all. We're talking about two brothers who have reached the absolute, undisputed pinnacle of their professional sporting careers. I mean, these are guys who spend their entire lives executing incredibly complex, highly strategic playbooks with literal millimeter precision on a football field. They've got the Super Bowl rings, they've got the massive contracts, they've got millions of people watching their every single move. Yet, when you strip away the helmets and you take away the roar of the stadium and you just look at the raw reality of their personal lives, their journeys through the modern dating world are as chaotic, completely fumbling, and hilariously messy as a Hollywood comedy script. It's just the ultimate juxtaposition, right? We're going to trace a timeline today from the very early, incredibly disastrous days of them swiping on dating apps all the way up to a globally recognized star-studded wedding event that broke the internet. We're going to look really closely at how these two very different brothers approached finding a partner. We'll cover the catastrophic first dates, the incredibly bold public gestures, and how their entire family dynamic literally shifted overnight when one of the most famous musicians on the planet entered the picture. So get comfortable and buckle up, because understanding how these modern love stories actually came to be, it really changes our whole perspective on how romance works in the digital age. Right off the bat, I want you to just take a moment and try to process the sheer, unadulterated chaos of that number on the screen. 20 million unread direct messages. Let's be real for a second. For the average person, getting a handful of messages on a dating app or Instagram can feel a little bit overwhelming, right? Maybe a little ego boosting, sure, but it's mostly a manageable thing. You check it, you reply, you move on. But for Travis Kelce, the digital dating landscape had become an absolute unnavigable war zone. The imagery he uses here, saying there is literal smoke coming out of his DMs, brilliantly captures exactly why a high-profile athlete might feel entirely paralyzed by the prospect of finding a genuine connection online. He openly admitted that he was genuinely terrified to even open that inbox. And I want you to stop and think about the psychology of that for a second. How do you possibly sift through that level of sheer, blinding volume to find someone who actually wants to get to know you for you, rather than just the guy they see catching touchdowns on television every single Sunday? Let's do the math on this. If you spent just one single second looking at each of those 20 million messages, it would take you almost an entire year of doing nothing else. No sleeping, no eating, just swiping to clear the inbox. It's insane. This massive, insurmountable wall of digital noise serves as the absolute crucial baseline for everything we're about to explore today. It sets up the exact reason why Travis eventually had to completely abandon the traditional online route and do something incredibly public and completely old school just to get noticed. But, before we get to Travis's grand gesture, we actually have to look at how his older brother navigated this exact same digital gauntlet just a few years earlier. Because as you're going to see, Jason's approach was entirely hilariously different.
Section 1, the infamous Tinder beginnings. Let's take a look at exactly how Jason and Kylie got their start.
So, before the global superstardom really hit critical mass, the Kelce brothers were just navigating the wild, unpredictable world of dating apps exactly like the rest of us. And to really understand Jason's approach to Tinder, you first have to understand the fundamental Kelce family dynamic. It operates very much like a sitcom, and I mean that literally. The inside story from everyone who knows them is that this is a family where people just walk straight through the front door without knocking, yelling yellow at the absolute top of their lungs, and immediately roping whoever's in the room into intense drinking games. And these aren't just normal games. They're specifically designed not for anyone to win, but just to trick you and make you feel foolish for their own amusement. It is an intense, boisterous, wildly loud environment. So if you're going to enter this family, you need a very specific kind of introduction, and you need to be incredibly resilient. Now, Jason's entry into the modern dating sphere. It was not polished. It was absolutely not curated by some high-end public relations team. In fact, Jason's approach to his Tinder profile was an absolute masterclass in sending the most confusing mixed signals humanly possible. On one hand, he thought he was being very clever with his main profile picture. He believed there was solid evidence that he was an NFL player because he used a photo of himself standing on the sideline from a preseason game. Sounds logical, right? But he made a fatal, hilarious error. He cropped the photo to fit Tinder's specific image dimensions. By doing so, he completely eliminated the television ticker at the bottom, he cut out all the lower third broadcast graphics, and, most unbelievably of all, he completely cropped out the actual Philadelphia Eagles emblem on his athletic shirt. So, as far as anyone swiping through the app could tell, he just looked like a sweaty, random equipment manager standing around with a bunch of other random people. He almost entirely self-sabotaged his own profile visually. But then,
And this is where it gets amazing. Look at the other side of the equation. If you actually took the time to read his profile text, it was completely contradictory to his ragged, unpolished, confusing photo. He wrote, in plain text, that he was looking to have deep, meaningful conversations and explicitly mentioned that he wanted to talk about getting married and having kids. He was completely, vulnerably laying all of his cards right there on the digital table. It is, without a doubt, the most baffling combination of visual and written communication you could possibly ever put on a dating app.
But here is the crazy part. Despite that incredibly confusing, heavily cropped, sweaty sideline photo, Kylie actually did exactly what Jason was hoping for. She swiped right. But that guy promising the deep conversations about family and the future, yeah, Kylie quickly realized she was dealing with, in her own incredibly affectionate words, a literal Neanderthal. The high expectations that were set by that sweet, deeply romantic Tinder biography came crashing down to reality almost immediately upon their first in-person meetings. Jason was absolutely not showing up as this sophisticated conversationalist ready to casually discuss the intricacies of a lifelong commitment over a nice, quiet candlelit dinner. No, he showed up as his raw, unfiltered, loud, bearded self. It was a massive bait and switch. And honestly, this brilliantly sets up what has to be one of the most legendary, catastrophic early dates ever recorded in a modern romance. Because look, if you think a cropped sideline photo and some heavy Neanderthal energy is a red flag, just wait until you hear the play-by-play breakdown of how their second time hanging out actually went down in real time. It is wild.
The early dating life of Jason and Kylie was an absolute, unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. And yet, somehow it laid the rock-solid foundation for a beautiful family life. We just have to tell this exactly like the hilarious, messy bar story it actually is. So paint this picture in your mind. They're at a local spot, a standard bar hangout, and just 45 minutes after Kylie actually arrives, which is barely enough time to even get through a first round of drinks and get settled in, Jason is completely inebriated and literally falls asleep on the bar table. Just dead asleep. Out cold. That is definitely not the deep, meaningful conversation he was promising in his Tinder bio, right? The situation is so incredibly dire that his Philadelphia Eagles teammate, Bo Allen, who is affectionately referred to in the story as Honey Bobo, has to actually step in and intervene. And Bo doesn't just, call a cab and gently guide him out. No, he executes a literal, full-on fireman carry just to physically remove Jason from the premises and get him back to his apartment safely. Now, I want you to think about the sheer physics of that for a second. You have a massive NFL defensive tackle trying to haul a 290-pound NFL center out of a bar like a sack of potatoes. It's a visual spectacle. But the absolute wildest part of the entire ordeal is that Jason doesn't just go peacefully into the night. He actively and physically fights Bo Allen the entire way back. He was intentionally wiggling free, intentionally making himself anti-deadweight, because in his highly inebriated state, he viewed the entire extraction process as a physical challenge. He was literally turning the public sidewalk into a wrestling mat, making himself look completely foolish right in front of the girl he was actively trying to court. It is exactly the kind of behavior that would make 99% of people delete your number immediately, block you on everything, and never speak to you again. Yet, miraculously, against all odds, this didn't scare Kylie away at all. In fact, she stuck around, and she eventually integrated into the family seamlessly, matching Jason's chaotic energy later on during intense family drinking games in Hawaii, and proving without a doubt that she could handle the sitcom-like insanity of the Kelce clan.
Section 2. Travis's digital dating struggles. Because while Jason was successfully settling down, Travis was striking out. Okay, so while Jason was getting married and starting to have children, despite his disastrous, sleep-inducing bar performances, Travis was attempting to use his massive public platform to find love. Over the last couple of years, he had essentially turned his wildly popular podcast into a personal dating app, openly discussing his romantic life and constantly putting feelers out into the universe. Naturally, as this is happening, fans of the family began to wonder if Kylie, who had successfully navigated her way into the family, survived the fireman carry date, and clearly had a great head on her shoulders, was secretly working behind the scenes to play matchmaker for Travis. After all, setting up your single brother-in-law is a completely relatable, time-honored family tradition, right? but Kylie made it incredibly clear during a fan Q&A that she was absolutely not getting involved in that mess. When asked explicitly if she had ever tried to set Travis up with a significant other, her answer was a definitive, hard no. She flat out refused to take on that responsibility, and her reasoning for it is actually fascinating. She pointed out that she had once given Travis some helpful intel, basically a fair warning to stay far away from a specific girl who had slid into his DMs, because that girl used to go to Kylie's high school, and she knew the history. So she was totally willing to play defense, keeping the glaring, obvious red flags away from him, but she was definitely not playing offense. She also noted that most of her good friends were already dating or married anyway, so she simply didn't have a curated roster of candidates to offer him. But the real kicker, the absolute main reason, is that Kylie felt she didn't need to help him because his DMs essentially spoke for themselves. Travis was doing just fine on his own in terms of sheer volume, even if that volume, remember those 20 million terrifying unread messages we talked about earlier, was completely unmanageable. Kylie was officially washing her hands of the entire situation, stepping back, and leaving Travis to figure out his own romantic destiny.
Section 3. The Arrowhead Friendship Bracelet. This is where everything shifts.
So this is it. This is the pivotal moment where Travis decided to finally take matters into his own hands in a very public, very vulnerable way. He finally realized that the digital world, the 20 million DMs, the dating apps, it just wasn't going to cut it anymore. He had to cross the barrier into the real world. So when the massive Eras Tour came to Arrowhead Stadium, Travis executed a play that was entirely devoid of any real logistical strategy, but it was absolutely packed with an unbelievable amount of heart. And the most incredible part of this whole thing is how Taylor Swift actually received it. She didn't view it as a creepy or entitled move from a famous athlete who thinks he can get whatever he wants. She viewed it as a grand, deeply romantic gesture. Look at this quote. She explicitly compared it to an 80s John Hughes movie, directly evoking that iconic, culturally ingrained cinematic image of a guy standing outside a window with a boombox held over his head, putting all of his feelings on the line for the whole world to see. It's such a fascinating cultural collision when you really stop and think about it. You have the hyper-masculine, fiercely competitive, aggressive world of the NFL clashing directly with the romantic storybook tropes of Taylor Swift's songwriting. From her perspective, this guy just showed up out of nowhere and essentially said, "I want to date you, give me a chance, just meet me once." The inside story reveals that she felt, as long as this guy wasn't crazy, this was exactly the kind of pure romantic pursuit she'd been writing multi-platinum songs about since she was a teenager. Travis was literally sitting in the stadium, listening to her set list, hearing her sing about these exact grand scenarios, and he internalized it. He accidentally became the living, breathing embodiment of the romantic hero from her music, stepping entirely out of his comfort zone to make a connection that felt incredibly pure and delightfully normal.
But here's the funny thing. His grand, boombox-style romantic moment actually played out a lot more like a hilariously failed heist movie on the actual night of the concert. Let's really walk through the disastrous logistics of Travis's playbook here because it's so funny. First, he attends the Eras Tour at his own stadium, Arrowhead. He's on his absolute home turf. He knows the building inside and out. Second, he makes a customized friendship bracelet with his personal phone number on it, fully intending to hand it directly to Taylor Swift himself. But here is where the master plan completely falls apart. His absolute lack of logistical foresight. He just assumed that because he played for the Chiefs, because his face is literally plastered all over the outside of the building, that he could just waltz right down to the VIP tents. He thought he could just turn on the charm, smile at the elevator lady, and get immediate access to the highly secure backstage area. But the elevator lady was fiercely independent, she was doing her job exactly to the letter, and she completely and unequivocally denied him access. Think about the massive comedic ego check of being one of the most famous athletes in the entire city, standing inside the very stadium you play in, and being completely shut down by stadium staff. He could not get through. This blunt rejection led to Travis going on his podcast the following week and throwing what was brilliantly described as a literal man tantrum. He was visibly butthurt, openly pouting, and genuinely upset that he didn't get to meet her. But here's the genius of it. That public tantrum, that complete lack of filter, and that raw vulnerability is exactly what worked. That full send on the podcast was the shot heard around the world. Because he was so open about it, a massive support system immediately activated. Everyone who knew Travis, including his notoriously tough legendary head coach Andy Reid, along with relatives and close friends, started whispering in Taylor's ear behind the scenes. They became his impromptu high-powered wingmen, privately vouching that this guy complaining on a podcast was actually an amazing, incredible stand-up human being. It was a massive community effort that ultimately bridged the gap that his lack of logistics couldn't cross.
Section 4. A new demographic of fans. The aftermath of the relationship going public.
So once Taylor and Travis officially connected and took things public in September of 2023, the cultural impact was immediate, and it was absolutely massive for the entire Kelce family. The dynamic shifted literally overnight. They were suddenly thrust into the absolute white-hot center of the global pop culture zeitgeist. and arguably no one felt this whiplash more acutely or more hilariously than Jason Kelce. We really need to analyze this demographic flip because the cultural shock here is just staggering. For 13 brutal seasons, Jason was a legendary, grizzled, hard-nosed center for the Philadelphia Eagles. As he explained it himself, his interactions with fans used to be almost entirely dominated by, and this is his exact, hilariously blunt phrasing here, large, fat men coming up to him on the street, aggressively shaking his hand, and violently thanking him for being an Eagle. That was his core demographic. That was his daily reality for over a decade. Hardcore, intense, gritty football guys. Now, because of his brother's relationship, Jason experienced what he called a very big, gradual flip. His fan base suddenly shifted to being dominated by little girls. A whole new demographic of 10-year-old Swifties became deeply, intensely interested not just in Travis, but in the entire Kelce family ecosystem. Jason literally went from being this offensive line hero for fantasy football bros to a highly recognizable, beloved figure for millions of young pop fans worldwide who, let's be honest, probably didn't even know what a center did a year ago. The comedic whiplash of a 290-pound bearded man trying to navigate this totally new, sparkly reality is one of the most drastic and hilarious demographic shifts we have ever seen in the history of sports and celebrity.
Section 5, the star-studded NYC wedding. Let's look at the absolute grand culmination of this story. All right, so we are officially moving from the gritty, beer-soaked sports bars of Philadelphia and the rejected awkward elevator rides at Arrowhead Stadium to the absolute pinnacle of high society. Picture this scene for me. It's Friday, July 3rd. We aren't at a standard hometown church. We aren't at a quiet, rustic vineyard. The event is taking place at Madison Square Garden in New York City. The sheer scale of this is almost hard to comprehend. The entertainment isn't a standard wedding cover band plugging in their amps in the corner. No, this event features live acoustic performances by literal rock legends Paul McCartney and Stevie Nicks, the latter being a longtime personal mentor to the bride. It is a musical powerhouse event with unmatched celebrity firepower in the room. But amidst all of this global stardom, all of these flashing lights, the core, down-to-earth Kelce family remained front and center. Jason Kelce proudly stood up there as the best man for his brother, a very, very long way from being fireman carried out of a pub by his teammate. And in an incredibly beautiful grounding touch that just brings it all together, Jason and Kylie's 4 daughters, little Wyatt who is 6, Elliot who is 5, Bennett who is 3, and tiny little Finley at just 15 months old, they all served together as the Flower Girls. It was this massive, surreal collision of the humble, sitcom-like Kelce family dynamic and the highest possible echelon of international celebrity. It's hard to imagine a starker contrast than toddlers throwing flower petals while an actual member of the Beatles watches from the front row. But perhaps the absolute most surprising detail from the entire reception is that the groom himself, Travis Kelce, actually grabbed a microphone and sang for the guests. So even surrounded by absolute musical royalty, Jason proudly confirmed that his brother actually stepped up and successfully held his own during the reception. Jason noted, quote, "Yeah, Trav can sing. Trav has always been able to carry a tune." Now, the really funny inside story here is that Jason explicitly mentioned that musical ability is absolutely not a trait they inherited from their parents. So Travis pulling this off, this was completely on his own merit. When attendees were talking about the event and mentioned that both the bride and the groom sang and that Travis was actually quite good, Jason immediately agreed. He did admit, of course, with his usual dry, self-deprecating family humor, that obviously Travis paled in comparison to the legendary icons performing that night. I mean, you were literally competing with Paul McCartney and Stevie Nicks. There's no winning that battle. But think about the sheer audacity of that moment. For a tight end and in the National Football League to grab the microphone at Madison Square Garden, look out at a crowd packed with musical legends, and confidently carry a tune at his own wedding, that is a testament to the absolute unshakable confidence, the pure joy, and the total fearlessness that Travis brings to everything he does. It perfectly, absolutely encapsulates his entire persona. It is the absolute perfect capstone to a guy who wasn't afraid to throw a boombox-style Hail Mary pass on a podcast in the first place. Whether with a homemade friendship bracelet or a live microphone at MSG, the guy shoots his shot. So just look at the incredible, almost unbelievable journey we just traced today. On one hand, you have Jason and Kylie, a rock-solid relationship built on the extraordinarily shaky, questionable foundation of a terrible, completely self-sabotaged Tinder profile, a guy falling dead asleep 45 minutes into a date, and then aggressively fighting a defensive tackle on the sidewalk who was just trying to carry him home safely. And then, on the exact other hand, you have Travis and Taylor, a global romance sparked by a totally failed attempt to hand over a friendship bracelet, thwarted by a stadium elevator attendant, followed by a literal podcast tantrum, which ultimately activated a network of high-profile wingmen and led to a wedding at Madison Square Garden featuring a Beatle. It is completely absurd.
And yet, it is completely 100% real. It brilliantly illustrates that there is absolutely no perfect, sanitized, PR-approved formula for finding your person. Whether you are a football center tricking people in a loud drinking game or a pop star writing songs about a guy showing up with a boombox, the messy, chaotic, and entirely unpredictable nature of human connection is what actually makes it work in the end. So I have to ask you, knowing how wild the reality of these high-profile relationships actually is behind the scenes, how does the sheer unpredictability of these modern love stories change your own expectations of romance? Think about that next time you're swiping or sending a DM. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I will see you on the next explainer.